Welcome back, everyone, to the Dank History Show. It's been a hot minute.
It's only been a week.
Well, it's been 2 weeks.
2 weeks?
Yeah, 2 weeks from the last time we talked.
That makes way more sense.
Because, we talked about Halloween, and then last week was Halloween, and this week we're back.
It makes sense.
Yeah. And this week, today is not a very well-known day, but something big did happen in history today. And that was the beginning of the Soviet Communist Revolution on November the 7th, 1917. A whole whopping 102 years ago? That's
yes.
right. Yeah,
yes.
My math is correct. So, on that day, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, that's Vladimir Lenin, for those who don't know.
Not John Lennon.
No, not John Lennon.
For the longest time, I thought it was.
Really? You did?
When I was little, yeah.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah, well, to be fair, I thought a lot of weird stuff when I was little, too. So.
Thanks, Brad. I'm sure I'm not the only one.
Oh, yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example. There's a bunch of really weird stuff, I thought. Oh, I thought that, humans reproduce asexually when I was, 5 to about 10.
So did everyone.
I just thought, it just happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's normal, though.
That's completely normal. So, John Lennon and the Bolshevik and the Beatles. John Lennon and the Beatles.
Oh. I'm trying to think of a song right now. Something about days of...
Back in the USSR. Don't know how lucky you are. Back in the USSR. That's a Beatles song, I think. Isn't it?
I thought it was a...
Was it a Beatles or a Bee Gees? I can't remember.
Yes, it was.
It was a Beatles song?
It was.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Cool.
Because I remember that was actually...
For some reason, I thought it was David Bowie, because it sounds like something he would have said.
Yeah. Although David Bowie didn't talk that much about politics. He was more like...
He had, weird stuff.
That's true. Ground control to Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom.
You're silly.
Did you take your protein pills and put your helmet on?
Not today.
All right. We'll remember to do that. We're going to do that tomorrow.
Okay.
So, this event, the October Revolution, is probably the one event in history that's really probably extremely momentous. So, today, we're going to talk...
And nobody knows about it.
Yeah, no one knows about it, and we're going to talk about it.
It's so monumental.
Exactly.
Keep going.
Did I say something weird just a second?
No.
Oh.
Just that it was monumental, and then you said nobody knows about it earlier.
Yeah. Well, not as many people know about the actual date, when it happened. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the Soviet Union itself, but we're also going to talk more generally about communism. Where did this idea come from? And we're also going to ask several critical questions. We're going to ask, what's the legacy of the communist ideology? And did the Soviet Union accurately follow communism?
Hi, Gretchen. I got your text. She said it was a Beatles song.
Okay. That was my mom, by the way. Thanks. So, and what does it mean for all of us today? Because communism as a term for us today is still kind of used in a pejorative sense. Is that the right word I'm looking for?
I've probably only seen it written. I don't know what you're saying.
Pejorative. It's Pejorative.
Prerogative? No.
Pejorative. I'm pretty sure that's how it's pronounced. I might be wrong. Though. It might be like macabre.
Pejorative? Oh, that is a word.
Yeah. It means
I'm
in a
sure
negative
I've seen it
sense.
Before.
Almost some...
Yep, you're right.
Oh, great. Awesome.
Thank you, Google.
So, especially in American politics, but in other countries as well, it's sort of used as they're dirty commie or something like that.
Dirty commie.
And we're going to talk a little bit about when all of this got started. So, now most people would think, okay, well, you're going to talk about Karl Marx. But actually, we have to, all ideas have origins prior to their formation. All new ideas have their roots in something earlier. That's what I was trying to say.
Well, like they say that there's nothing new under the sun. Mm-hmm. That's a proverb.
It's Ecclesiastes.
It's
so a proverb.
Same
yes.
concept.
Same genre. So let's talk a little bit about sort of socialism and communistic-like ideas before Karl Marx. So there are a few countries throughout history that have sort of toyed around with this idea. For example, there was this empire in India called, and I have no idea how to pronounce this, so just bear with me, the Mauryan Empire. And that existed in the 3rd century BC, around the same time as Alexander the Great's Greek Empire. And that place was described as almost kind of having almost like monarchical socialism. You know, a lot of things were shared in common, things were redistributed a lot. So that was one of them. And also, the ancient Greeks would sort of play around with this idea. Like, there was this play by this guy named Aristophanes in ancient Greece called, I have no idea how to pronounce this either, Ecclesia Suzase.
I looked at that word and I'm like, yeah, good luck.
Yeah, good luck. It's all Greek to me.
It truly is.
It really is.
We should have somebody who actually knows Greek come on and do this.
Yeah, we should. And pronounce all of these. Like, because as John Green once said, mispronouncing words is my thing.
That's Bradley Cooper's thing. He stole that from John Green.
I did steal from John. But who stole it first? Like, who had the name first, me or Bradley Cooper?
That has nothing to do with John Green.
But, similar concept. Who envisioned the Bradley Cooper essence first?
That has nothing to do with John Green.
Who envisions the essence of mispronouncing the words first?
John Green, he's much older. And the other Bradley Cooper, he had it first.
Because he was older?
Yes.
Yeah. Ageist. So, this play by Aristophanes imagines a society where the women of Athens seized the means of production and banned all private property. So obviously that was sort of an idea people thought of, like, oh, this could maybe happen. And also, a lot of Christian thinkers and early church history also really toyed around or interacted with these proto-socialistic ideas. For example, in Acts, and that's in the Bible for those who don't know, we see verses that describe the church members and these early church communities and, places like Jerusalem and Judea and places like that, all sharing everything in common and having communal money pots, essentially, where people would bring their money together, put it together, and help the people out who were less fortunate. And also, even after that, many Christian thinkers started to believe that the very concept of private property and mine and yours might in fact be at odds with the overall Christian message. There's this one guy John Chrysanthemum, he has been sainted by various Christian churches, said these words, "Mine and thine, these chilling words which introduce wars into the world should be eliminated from the world. Then the poor would not envy the rich, because there would be no rich. And neither would the poor be despised by the rich, for there would be no poor. All things would be in common." There was also a guy named this autocorrected as Saint Basic the Great.
Saint Basic.
Saint Basic. You basic.
Saint Basic.
You basic. Basil. This should be Basil, not Basic.
Yeah, same thing.
He argued that people shouldn't hoard their wealth, but rather give it away and also spend it freely. So it sort of goes back into society and, improves society through the movement of money. So these were definitely some ideas that were circulating, especially because, in the Bible it seems Jesus will often say things like, sell all you have and give to the poor and stuff like that. And so these ideas were flowing around in this early years. Now, skipping forward all the way into the 1700s, we see an old guy named Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine. Hold on, I'm trying to remember. Common Sense?
Yes, Common Sense.
I didn't even look ahead.
And I can't remember what the other one was, but it was like, he wrote one while they were in, what is it, Valley Forge? He wrote another book or something like that.
I honestly don't remember.
Because remember there was an episode of Liberty Kids where he had to write another one.
No. Oh, I thought it was Common Sense that he wrote with them.
Yes, but Common Sense was his first one before the revolution got started. And then in 1776, when everyone was all sad because they were losing all the time, he had to write another pamphlet to get their spirits up. Do you remember that episode? Because I feel like that was an episode.
I feel like that might be a thing. Let me see.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Liberty Kids was this really great show on PBS. It was an animated show. I think think it ran the early 2000s, but it basically covered these three kids who lived during the time of the American Revolution. There was a French kid, an American kid, and a British girl. And it was sort of their experiences going through it. And it's probably one of the best kids programs for describing something like war, because it wasn't like, super, all America all the time. It also showed the people who didn't benefit from the American Revolution, like the Native Americans and, the African American slaves. And it also showed the British perspective. So it had a very nuanced view of the Revolution. So
I'm still looking. American Crisis?
American Crisis, that was it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. He wrote a few more.
Yeah. He was probably a very radical Enlightenment thinker. So, and the Enlightenment was basically this whole philosophical found movement that started up in the 1600s, where a lot of ideas come from today, like, rights to liberty, pursuit of happiness, all that stuff. So, but Thomas Paine wrote a book called Agrarian Justice, which called for a tax on property owners to help pay for the needs of the poor. And there's also a guy named Charles Hull who wrote a book in 1806 which began to denounce the capitalistic effect on the poor. So there are already these sort of ideas floating around. But around comes the early 1800s, and what happens? Industrial Revolution. So you got factories, you got people moving from farms into the cities, you got children working in factories, you have women working in factories, you have all the labor issues that come for that as people start to work very long hours. So, and with those came a lot of social problems, from ranging from, the environment, like there are a lot of smog and pollution, stuff like that, to the effects on the family, as the family units would break down, as people would move away from their families in the farm, or, the fathers couldn't be around with their kids, and, they'd be so overworked that they end up, drinking away all their money at saloons and stuff like that. So the Industrial Revolution brought about a lot of changes to the way we do things, and it improved the quality of life in many ways through all these new inventions, but it also led to many new social problems. And in the 1830s and 1840s, people began looking for alternatives to the capitalistic industrialist mindset, which was, just leave us alone, let us do our thing. And these included guys like Charles Fourier, Louis Blanc, and Saint-Simon Leblanc. And they all looked at the excesses of poverty and the inequality of the Industrial Revolution, and they thought there needs to be a more egalitarian distribution of wealth. And maybe a solution to that is we can transform these big urban areas into much smaller societies, little smaller groups where we can create these more utopian societies. And what's interesting about this is that Saint-Simon, he believed that you should build this idea of socialism into the foundation of these utopian communities. And we've talked previously about some of these utopian communities. Like, do you remember when we talked about New Harmony, Indiana, not too far from here?
Was that the creepy cult?
That was, what were they called? There was one cult where they shared everything in common, but they also had like communal marriage.
I kind of remember that one.
Yeah,
was that them?
That wasn't New Harmony. New Harmony was more socialistic, but I'm trying to remember what it was called.
We can probably go back and look.
Yeah, but that was that community where it's like the older members of society would induct the younger ones through sex.
That was the one that scared me. I was like, okay.
Yeah. Well, it was an early version of hippieism, except it was a little different.
Just a little bit.
The 1800s variety. So, as you can see, socialism really began to pop up in stronger numbers as people would see just how radical the inequality really could be in these industrialized environments where people were just working long hours, not getting enough pay, having worse health, and just also seeing this new growth of a new social class, which were the capitalists, the people who owned the factories, the people who ran the factories, the people who really invented the stuff, just how they were slowly just stacking up more and more wealth on the backs of the working class. So, now that we talked a little bit about sort of the basics, let's get into the main man himself, old Karl Marx.
That man's got a beard.
He does have a beard. He has a very impressive beard.
I like it.
So actually, we saw an interesting thing. Like, he's buried in, I think, in London, and this like the
Why
oldest
is he in
Victorian.
London?
That actually will come up later.
Never mind. Keep going.
But it's kind of he has this huge like bust of his head on his gravestone, but like lightning or something struck it, and now it tilts slightly to the left, much like his ideology.
As you do.
Tilts to the left.
God struck it.
Hey, now if we don't
Struck it down.
we don't make such evangelical statements here on Dank History Show. We keep things.
You know, somebody probably already made that joke.
Oh yeah, someone already has. But we try to keep things as non-biased as possible. You know what I mean? I mean, obviously we have to talk about our opinions, but yep. He struck him down. So we got to talk about the big man himself, Karl Marx, and Dank.
The big man himself.
I'm sure there's a joke there somewhere. So this guy was born in 1818 in the city of Trier. And this was a town which was part of Prussia's province of the Lower Rhine. Prussia, for those who don't know, was a part of Germany, but there was no Germany at the time. Germany was basically a very loose group known as the German Confederation. Germany itself wouldn't pop up for another 60 years.
Interesting.
So, this guy, he was ethnically Jewish on both sides of his family. He actually had famous rabbis within that time period, on both his mother and his father's side. And his father's, Heinrich Marx, was a largely non-religious man who was very interested in Enlightenment philosophy. So that would be guys like, Kant, Voltaire, Locke. Didn't you read some of Voltaire's stuff for school? Like a college class?
Maybe?
Candide?
Oh, yeah, I did.
Yeah. Funny guy. And his wife, Heinrietta Pressburg, was the very wealthy Dutch woman. And what's interesting is that her family would actually later go on to found the company Philips Electronics, if you've ever heard of Philips. They make
are they the toothbrush people?
They might make electric toothbrushes, but what they're mainly known for is like TVs, remote controls, like headphones, stuff like that.
Trying to see if anything here is Philips. I don't think so.
Yeah. I know we've had Philips equipment ourselves, but I can't remember exactly. Oh, the Philips CDI. Remember with the weird linked Zelda games? I can't wait to bomb some Dodongos.
That was what that was?
Yeah, Philips made that.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yep. So, this guy, at the age of 17, Karl Marx enrolled in the University of Bonn. Where he got... James Bond. Where he got in trouble for getting involved in sort of politically radical groups and, getting involved in duels, as people do in college. I mean, didn't you challenge people to duels in college?
I don't know. We did get some water guns.
That's true. Someone just walked by and gave us water guns earlier.
Would you like to have a water gun duel?
Sure, let's do it. Away from this equipment, obviously, but we can do it like next to the T-Rex.
The T-Rex would win.
It would. It's powerful. So, but because of all this, his father had him transfer to University of Berlin because, he just wasn't doing well with his grades. He was getting pretty wild. And during this time, Marx became a big fan of this German philosopher named J.W.F. Hegel, which Hegel really wanted to look at what made a society, what influenced it, what determined its destiny. So, in his young adult life, he met and married a woman named Jenny von Westphalen, who was a German aristocrat, and they would actually have a 7-year engagement because it would take a long time for them to get married because they came from very different social classes and also, religious backgrounds, which was a pretty big deal in the 1800s. So she was a big influence on his life, but another guy was also a big influence, and that was Friedrich Engels.
I did that really poorly. I'm sorry. Friedrich Engels.
Yes.
Cool.
And
I am so sorry. I butchered that.
It's all good. Hey, butchering pronunciation is...
That can be your thing. No, wait, that's what he says.
Yes.
There has to be a way around it.
Mangling pronunciation is our trope.
There you go.
There we go.
That way we're not stealing from John.
I like the word trope. It's fun to
You're
say.
a trope.
Thank you. So he met this guy in a cafe in France, as all good stories begin or end in a cafe.
Or end.
Yeah,
It
or
ended
begin.
outside of a cafe, though.
What story are you thinking of?
Oh, what's his face?
Batman?
Not Batman. That was outside of a theater. Oh, the World War One. My brain is dead. Franz Ferdinand.
Yeah, but what movie are you referring to? Oh, that's right. He got killed outside of a cafe. That's right.
Yes, it wasn't inside. It was outside.
Yeah, outside of a cafe. That was a deep cut. I appreciate that. So he got involved with this guy, and Engels would show Marx his work on the working class in England, so his written work, which convinced Marx that really the working class would need to bring about some sort of revolution to transform society. And in the 1840s, when these guys were meeting, socialism had become a big buzzword. People were talking about it. You know, the intellectuals are like, okay, what's the right, wrong? How do we do this? And in 1848, Engels and Marx would come together to write their most famous work ever, the Communist Manifesto.
You put Communism Manifesto.
Yeah,
It's the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And this is actually, I've read this little pamphlet. It's very interesting because it actually spends a lot of its time almost like critiquing the other forms of socialism and less time arguing for the specifics. And what's interesting is that most people more know about the Communist Manifesto than all of Marx's other works, where he gets into the more, theoretical versions of it.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because it was just it was sort of almost like a beginning point. This was the beginning. And also what happened right after the Communist Manifesto was published.
Oh, yeah.
So this work really couldn't have come at a better time, because immediately after its publication, Europe was shook by revolts all throughout 1848 as people who were wanted pro-republic or, leftist agitators took to the streets demanding better governments. Many of them wanted to get rid of the monarchies. They wanted more representation. And these swept almost every country in Europe at the time, particularly, Prussia, Austria, France, those places like that. Now, eventually all these revolutions, died down or were crushed. And Marx himself, after this, his ideas were viewed as very dangerous because, here's this seditious guy calling for the, removal of our very system, a revolution or something like that. So, because of this, he would actually end up getting banished from basically every country in Europe except for England. So, he and his family would flee to London. And afterwards, even though he had been banished from basically everywhere, he would continue to be involved in politics on an international level. One thing I found that was very interesting is he would write for a paper called the New York Daily Tribune, which, was based all the way in America. And he would write stories on European politics. And he would also write about American issues like slavery and the Civil War. And the New York Daily Tribune was initially an abolitionist paper, but when the Civil War broke out in America, they started, backing away from that, calling for just a general peace, with no abolition of slavery.
Right.
And Marx heavily disagreed with that because he himself was an abolitionist. So in 1863, they kind of kicked him off the paper. But even after that, Marx would continue to write and agitate through change through books such as Das Kapital, which is his
I've heard
big...
of that one.
Yeah, that's his big, huge manifesto book. And through other communist organizations. And he largely believed communism had to come about from developed capitalistic societies. But in his later life, he came around to the ideas like, well, maybe a more agrarian society like Russia could possibly bring it about as well. Foreshadowing.
Shh. How dare you? Spoilers.
Spoilers. So I've talked a little bit about, that's Marx's life, but now I have to actually talk about his theories, because, we haven't talked a lot about that yet. So His main contribution, I believe, is he creates something known as conflict theory, which is the idea that all of history, what it really boils down to, is a conflict between the classes that develops throughout time. And here's how his theory goes. So all the way back, before people had developed agriculture, caveman societies, everything would probably be mostly shared in common, and there would be no clear class distinctions because everyone has to work all the time just to stay fed. So, according to Marx, that was sort of a primitive form of communism. But then we move on to feudalism, where people are growing stuff better, and there's an opportunity for a new class to emerge, the lords. But what the lords do is they basically hoard the extra food or money that's made for themselves, and so this rather than the surplus going back to everyone. And this trend continues in capitalistic societies, where the capitalists control the means of production. And by the means of production, I mean things like the factory, like the tools, like the materials. They own all that stuff, but the people who actually produce it and put it all together, those are the workers. And the only thing the workers have to offer is their labor, their hands, their abilities. But these workers will always be exploited for their labor because what the capitalists will do is they will take the surplus, so the cost of employing that employee versus the value that they put out, the product or the service, and they will take that surplus as profit and use it for whatever. And he believed that the forces of production, which were the factories, the capitalists, the technology, and the relations of production, that is, the relationship between those who own the means of production, those who do not, would run into problems, such as, the capitalists would try to drive wages down and raise productivity, cut costs. And that would create situations where, for the very first time, there would be too many goods. Like, the market might have, too many cotton shirts or something like that, or too much precious metals. And you have all these goods, and people wouldn't have the money to buy them.
It doesn't work if you don't pay your people. That you won't make any money.
Yeah, it creates these weird economic situations where you have this overproduction running into people not having enough money, and that leads to economic stagnation and downfall. And that's kind of weird when you think about it, because in most societies the problem is scarcity, excuse me. Not have enough goods like water, but for the very first time, too many goods can cause a problem. And what Marx believed is that the only solution to this problem, the forces of production running up against the relations of production, was class warfare. Something for where the workers would rise up and they themselves would seize the means of production. And that would be the factories, the stuff. And then from there, they would work to distribute it evenly among themselves. And one key tenet of his idea was to each, let me see if I remember how this is said properly. To each according to his need, to each according to his ability.
It's something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so it's basically, your needs will be met, but you also still have to work and contribute.
Right. And
that's actually one big misconception about communism. Because the misconception that comes up is it's kind of almost like, people should be lazy or whatever. Which actually isn't really true from Marx's perspective, because from his perspective, the real people who weren't working were people like the capitalists who were just reaping in the benefits, whereas the workers...
The fat cats who didn't do anything.
Yeah, the fat cats who didn't do anything, whereas the workers were getting crushed. So that was Marx's theory, and for the first, 50 or so years, it definitely sort of had some time to marinate. It didn't lead to any revolutions immediately, but time to marinate. People started adopting it. Larger numbers. There would be these communistic style and socialist groups all around the world, and then we get to one country that's going to be the very first one to try it, and that is none other than old Mother Russia.
Oh, Mother Russia.
It's a fun thing to say. Very fun.
Neither of us are from Russia, so I don't know why we're calling it Mother Russia.
Well, I mean, that's what they called it.
I know, but
It's fun.
it is fun to say.
It's interesting. I wonder if there's a... It seems like some places refer to it as the fatherland and others as the motherland. I wonder why that is. That might be something.
I
to
guess it
think
might
about.
depend on, like, I don't know, shot in the dark, if it's being kind or if it's being not kind?
Yeah, like kind or stern or something like that.
I don't know.
It's interesting. So Russia is actually even though obviously we all know that Russia went communist for a long time, but it was a pretty odd place for communism to gain power because, first of all, it was a pretty agrarian society for a lot of the 1800s, and it was also run as an absolute monarchy. So it wasn't really like England, where it was, a supposedly representative government and then a lot of capitalists. It was the Tsar, the emperor, who ran everything.
Right.
However, in the late 19th century, industrialization began to creep its way into Russia, and with it, some new ideas. First off, the serfs themselves were freed in 1861. And for some context, serfs were peasants, but worse.
They did not surf.
No, they didn't surf.
They didn't have surfboards.
It would have been a lot better if they had had surfboards because, who doesn't want to surf?
Russia's big. There wasn't enough ocean.
That's true. And it's pretty cold up where the oceans are.
They wouldn't even surf. They'd be stuck on the ice.
Yeah, you'd be skiing. Or what?
I guess I would be skiing or sledding.
Yeah, sledding. So what serfs are basically people who were literally tied to the place they were born, and they could almost be bought or sold with the land. So it was basically a slavery by any other word. But in 1861, this had been done away with, and all these serfs, what they'd end up doing is, because society's becoming more industrialized, they'd move to more urban areas, places like St. Petersburg or Moscow or places like that, to seek new employment. And this would create a big strain on Russian society for a number of reasons. First of all, you go from these very tightly knit communities to people moving away to urban areas. That causes, a lot of social tension. The other is, the health problems, the overcrowding, and then people for the first time having to deal with all these, new urban industrial realities. So what would happen is that a lot of people who had more revolutionary style ideas would begin to establish themselves, and that includes people such as Lenin. And Vladimir Lenin, he would try to work to change Russian society and bring about this Marxist sort of society. However, he himself would end up getting captured and banished in 1900 to London. Once again, it seems like a lot of the communists get sent to London for some reason.
Everybody likes London.
Yeah, it's a cool place. Where he would meet another guy, famous communist, named Leon Trotsky.
Leon Trotsky.
He's the guy with the glasses. Lenin is the guy who's bald, is the way I always look at it.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind.
Like Lenin is the bald guy with like this, and Trotsky is like this.
So anybody bald is not John Lennon.
It's John. John Lennon had long hair, didn't he?
He was the one with glasses.
That's true. So he was like a mixture of the two.
No, he was not bald though.
No. So I guess he would be like a mixture of Trotsky and Lenin.
Yeah.
So they would actually work together to help encourage communist-style cells in Russia, including one led by a guy named Joseph Stalin.
Joseph Stalin.
And his early involvement was basically, in these years, he was basically almost like a hired criminal who would go around robbing banks and doing various activities like that to raise money for the communist cells. So, where did I lost my place? So, we have to ask, well, why in the 1900s were things getting so crazy over there? And the reason for that is there had been a new czar came in, and that was a guy named Tsar Nicholas II, the very last one.
Anastasia.
Yeah, father of Anastasia. Anastasia?
It depends on how you pronounce it.
Yeah. And Tsar Nicholas II, he was to put it mildly, he could be a little bit incompetent or a little bit of a dingus. For example,
I love that you called him a dingus.
I like that term, dingus.
He's a little bit incompetent.
Mm-hmm.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Not everybody can do everything.
Not everyone can do everything. That's how it goes. And one problem is that he kind of didn't really know how to deal with these changing realities and would often, respond in a way that was very harsh and keeping with the absolute monarchy. And there was also there was some stuff happening outside of Russia that really hurt his prestige. For example, there was a war from 1904 to 1905 called the Russo-Japanese War. And this war pitted the Russians and Japanese against each other on the sea. And the Japanese actually defeated the Russians pretty badly. And for the European powers, this was a pretty big deal because obviously a lot of them had this pretty much all of them had this very imperialistic notion that the Europeans were better than, the Asians or people elsewhere.
Rude.
Yeah, that's just how they were. I'm just describing it. I'm not justifying it. But what?
I love that you had to explain yourself.
Well, sometimes I have to because
yes.
sometimes people would.
Some people could take it the wrong way.
Take it the wrong way. So them losing to an East Asian country was really viewed as a big embarrassment. And at the same time, there were other things internally happening in Russia. For example, there was this priest named Father Gapon, and he led a group of peasants in a procession to St. Petersburg to petition the Tsar Nicholas to listen to the workers and help them out because they were striking and complaining about the bad conditions and the factories and the low pay. However, when this peaceful group arrived in St. Petersburg, Russian troops fired upon them, and a lot of people died, and that became known as Bloody Sunday. And after that, there was a lot of riots and strikes which would occur all throughout Russia. And of course, am I too loud?
No, I'm just being silly.
Were you doing this?
Yes, I was raising the roof. I'm falling asleep right now. And it's not because of you. It's because I've had an 11-hour day.
Yeah, you need to get some rest tonight. Send you straight to bed when we get home.
Straight to bed. Wow, guys, I'm old.
Yeah, it's okay. We all get old every once in a while. And sleep is important.
Sleep is important.
Yeah, without sleep, you...
Well, I mean, it goes with this, keep...
Yeah, that's actually... So, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but actually the 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for recreation, that was a socialistic/unionist rallying cry.
So there you go.
So, but back to Russia, because we're going to talk about that later. So...
I'm sorry, I ruined your timeline.
Oh, it's all good. I like to jump around the timeline.
You sound like you're constipated.
I mean, I'm not.
Ladies and gentlemen, when Brad jumps, he sounds like he's constipated. And he also sounds like a Super Saiyan.
Yeah. Vegeta! So, the Russian government would try to deal with some of these issues through little political reform, like the Tsar Nicholas II called for a meeting of the Duma, the Russian parliament. But it didn't really do much because the Tsar pretty much kept all the power and nothing really changed. But there was one event that would bring about a huge amount of change, and that was an event which we talked about in previous episodes.
Multiple times.
Yeah, 3 episodes actually.
Again, multiple things. It was big, even though it was only
4 years.
4 years. It was really big.
Yeah, because everything sort of ties together, which I like that.
Yes.
And that was World War One.
The first one.
The first one. The
First is worse.
electric boogaloo.
Electric boogaloo.
So World War One was between Russia, England, and France versus Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and some other countries as well, like Serbia and the U.S. and all that. But the Russian army, when they started off the war, they had some big issues. They lost a lot. They weren't really prepared. Their armies weren't, equipped properly. So Tsar Nicholas decided he was going to take personal command of the army. And this would prove to be a very bad idea because this meant whenever the army would suffer a defeat, then he would get the blame for it. So that was a big no-no. Another big no-no was a person.
Oh, he's a big no.
No. Another big problem was a guy he kept in his court, which you might know from the Anastasia movie, named Grigory Rasputin. And Rasputin was... I could do a whole episode on him, honestly, but...
Was he as evil as Was it? It wasn't Disney.
Yeah, what company did do that?
Was it Disney? I don't
No,
think
it wasn't
It
Disney.
wasn't Disney. As the people there, Christopher Lloyd, was he as evil as Christopher Lloyd?
Well, he wasn't. I don't know if I'd just use the word evil to describe him. He was definitely a shady sort of guy because he was like this. He was this Orthodox priest, but he was never officially like ordained by anybody. And what he would do is he would often like go through these random like religious fervors, and then he would go out and like drink a whole lot and have sexual relations with a whole lot of different people, and they would come back and repent, and they'd do it all over again.
So he was just, yeah.
Yeah, and he was definitely sort of a very charismatic guy, and he got into the Tsar's court because many of his children had many blood diseases through being, incest, basically, led to that.
Fun. Not fun.
Not fun. So he was basically hired on as almost like a healer and spiritual advisor, but no one really liked him. The nobles didn't like him because, he was just this upstart weirdo. And the peasants didn't like him because there was all sorts of rumors about, this magic man who was going around, supposedly sleeping with the Tsarina and all sorts of stuff. So that definitely didn't help either. And eventually all this would boil down to, in 1917, there was huge food shortages and there was constant casualties in Russia. And that would lead to the February Revolution. Not the October one, the February one. And that would lead to the Tsar stepping down from power and the provisional government taking over. And this government was basically, more or less a republic. However, this government chose to actually continue fighting World War I, which was very unpopular. And it also failed to really redistribute any land to the peasantry, which was one of the big demands everyone had. And also around this time, Germany, who was, fighting in World War I at the time, they helped bankroll Lenin so he could actually return from exile to Russia. Because Germany at the time really wanted to fund communist efforts to sort of, get Russia out of the war.
Gotcha.
So, Lenin would return, and he would form a rival government to the provisional government called the Petrograd Soviet. Petrograd was the new name they had for St. Petersburg. And Lenin had two simple slogans. One was peace, bread, and land. Peace.
As you should. That's the best. If you have peace, and you have food, and you have place, you are good.
Exactly. So, and the second slogan was all power to the Soviets. We're going to take over the government, and we're going to bring forth our own communist revolution. And on November the 7th, his group, which was known as the Bolsheviks, they led a coup, and...
A coup? I used to think that was a coup.
A coup! Like a chicken coop!
A coup, 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 coup.
And they were actually... It's all good. We're all tired. You get some rest, and I will keep talking about communism.
It's so weird. Like, everybody hates... Well, not everybody, but a lot of people talk about how awful communism is. And it still sounds good. Even when you put it this way.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later and why that is. But a lot of that is just because, a lot of the ideas that communist and socialism have, they're still around with us today, and they still influence many of our better things in society, like, more equal opportunities, more equal pay, stuff like that.
Yeah, who doesn't like equality and everybody having a chance to be something?
Yes. Now, in Russia's case, when they did this through the coup, immediately after this, there was a civil war that would happen between those who supported the Soviets and those who didn't, the Red Army and the White Army. And the better led and unified Red Army would eventually win. But this was a very bloody conflict. And I really do think that the reason why the Soviet Union turned out as bad as it did is just because it was so violent, its origin. And Lenin, once he got control of things, he would set up something called the Politburo to run things in the new country. And this group would include many people, but the three main ones were himself, Leon Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin. Now, Trotsky was originally supposed to replace Lenin as the leader. And even though Lenin and Trotsky had some differences, like Lenin preferred a more centralized party where he was in control of things, and Lenin was kind of an egomaniac, whereas Trotsky was more for looser alliances, they still basically agreed on the most important things. And one of that was that they wanted communism to be this universal thing that would span across the whole world. It would get rid of borders. It would become this almost new world order. And Trotsky was supposed to take over, but after Lenin died, Stalin was able to basically gain power, gain allies, and kick Trotsky out of the Soviet Union, where he would live in exile in Mexico until 1940, when Stalin ordered him assassinated. And Stalin, unlike Trotsky, he didn't care about global communism at all. He believed in this thing called communism in one country, which basically meant just support us in the Soviet Union, which what really meant is he got to establish Russia as his own personal little dictatorship.
Well, that's not great.
Yeah, which is exactly what happened. And an interesting side note about Stalin, he actually originally went to a seminary when he was young.
Well, that's awkward.
Where he studied Marxist ideas and then, became who he was today. So I want to talk about this on a deeper level, because we often talk about, the horrors of the Soviet Union and stuff like that, the evil stuff Stalin did, all the gulags, all the killings, all that stuff. But one major question is whether these guys really followed the communistic message to its fullest. And that is kind of uncertain.
Really?
Yes, because what Karl Marx believed is he believed that something like an economic revolution would lead to a political change. And he imagined, workers uniting to all these unions, just coming together, shutting down the factories, and then the government basically acquiescing to their demands. Whereas Lenin believed that political change was necessary to bring about economic change. So, a revolution, get rid of the old order of things. And in societies that are struck by revolution and lots of bloodshed, dictators just tend to raise up. There are very few societies where this doesn't happen. I mean, look at France during the French Revolution, for example.
Vive la France!
Vive la France. Now, another part about Marx's ideas is he actually envisioned a society that wouldn't need a government anymore, an almost like utopian anarchist society.
That'll never happen.
Yeah, but that was his vision.
Utopias don't exist.
No, not this side of reality.
Your reality.
Your reality. And another interesting fact to remember is that everyone was very much opposed to communism, particularly in the Soviets early on. And this would lead to a mindset of a lot of extremism, both from the Soviets and other sides. And on the other side, the right-wing side as well, the fact that Karl Marx was Jewish, that coincided with a lot of the very anti-Semitic stuff that would burn in Europe for a long time.
Oh my, that opens up a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, if you look at a lot of the anti-Soviet propaganda from that time, a lot of it will show them as wearing a Star of David or something like that. So,
oh boy.
Yeah, those ideas they sort of began to pop up around that time. And another thing to remember about the Soviet Union is that for all of, the evil stuff Lenin and Trotsky did, Stalin really did take it and turn into a cult of personality about himself. Now, we've been talking about Russia a bit, and it's easy to forget that socialism and communism had an impact on all sorts of countries, including America.
Like you were saying about the 8-hour workday.
Yes. So socialism itself is a little different from communism in that it doesn't necessarily believe in an abolition of the private ownership of the means of production. And I can't believe I didn't say this earlier, but communism doesn't believe in, most forms of communism don't believe in a complete abolition of private property.
So anyone can come on your lawn and kick your dog.
Yeah, it's like people can still have houses and, stuff. It's just ownership of the means of production. That's the big thing. The factories, stuff like that.
Nobody owns factories?
The capitalists do. So the factories will be owned by the collective mass.
My brain is not working, Bradley.
It's all good.
I'm still confused by what you're trying to say.
So what I'm saying is they believe that, the means of production, like the factories and stuff, those should be owned by the entire country rather than just individuals. That's communism. Yeah.
Okay. But nobody can come on your property and kick your dog?
No, you couldn't do that.
But I thought you just said they didn't have private property.
I said that's a misconception, that there was no private property.
I didn't hear the first part.
Yeah.
Oops.
So Socialism, on the other hand, believed in creating more equal societies. And the idea is under socialism, people share resources more equally under a democratic government rather than centralized control under communism. And in America, the Socialist Party would actually gain some momentum in the 1900s. They would try to elect a guy named Eugene V. Debs.
Eugene V. Debs. I've heard of him.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy. He was born actually in Indiana, oddly enough. He
Oh,
lived in
yeah,
Terre
you
Haute.
told me about that. I remember. Oh, I remember when we did it. American History.
Yeah,
You told me about that.
and he was initially like a Indiana Democrat who like served on a local city, not local city, like the state government,
Gotcha.
the state senate, basically. But after spending some time with some unions and seeing how the Democrats really weren't helping the unions, he sort of came around to the idea of more communism and socialism. And he would read stuff like, what are you doing?
I'm being silly.
You're being funny. And he would actually end up running for president many times. And at some points, he would receive like 6% of the popular vote in 1912. And he would actually get almost 1 million votes while he was in prison.
A million in prison.
Yeah. And he had been sent to prison because he had criticized
That's
the policies
awesome.
of Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson.
Wait, he went to prison for criticizing?
Yes, because of the Sedition Act that was passed in World War One. When in America.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
weird.
Woodrow Wilson is the worst. I'll talk about him maybe.
When did they get rid of that?
I'm not really sure. I think it might still be on the books, but it's not in force, something like that.
Wow, that's really sad.
Yeah. So he would help found a group called the Industrial Workers of the World, WABIs as they're more commonly known, a union with the idea to unite every worker in the world, all the workers in the world, into a single group to sort of bring about change. And the stuff he would advocate for, Eugene V. Debs and the IWW, were things like better wages, better working conditions, health care, 40-hour work weeks, an end to child labor, better working conditions, all that stuff. And there's also other guys around the time in America writing stuff as well. Like there was a guy named Upton Sinclair who wrote a book called The Jungle. This book referred to like the horrific conditions in meat factories where there'd just be really gross stuff like human fingers thrown into the pits and like, the meat is all rotten and stuff like that. But funny aside note about Upton Sinclair, he wrote that book mainly as a call to socialism, but the American people were more grossed out by the bad conditions in the factories, so that led to the creation of the FDA, the Federal Drug and Food Administration, which inspects it to make sure there's not stuff like fingers in your soup.
Do you think salmonella and other foodborne illnesses kind of were rampant back then?
Oh yeah, because food, they're all packed together closely. There's no standards for how food should be made.
Yummy.
Snake oil salesmen, stuff like that. Medicine isn't regulated at all. So what's interesting about these socialistic policies is that the U.S. government would actually end up adopting them in interesting ways. Like Teddy Roosevelt would battle to break up monopolies. The 40-hour work week got established. We got things like, paid overtime, stuff like that. So a real question emerges from all of this. Like, where does that leave us with today? What's the true, legacy of communism and socialism? And one thing that's really interesting about this is, in a weird twist, the Soviet Union and all the old communist states have largely collapsed or either changed entirely. I mean, like China has kept up the centralized dictatorship form of government, but they're much more capitalistic now.
Right.
However, in other countries in the world, socialistic ideas are very commonplace. Almost every first world country has progressive tax rates, socialized medicine, maternity leave, stuff like that. So, and a lot of these countries are places in Europe and Japan, places that were opposed to the Soviet Union. So one idea I've heard a lot, and I think this is really true, is the idea of a purely capitalistic or purely communistic society. Those ideas,
work.
Yeah, they don't really work, and they're not really true. Every nation and government pretty much has a mixture of both. And it's easy to see why these ideas of communism and socialism took hold, because they give a message against exploitation of the workers, and especially in an era of increased industrialization. But at the same time, they also can become very extreme and, get involved in a lot of violence and a lot of, anti-religious persecution. So some of the takeaways I thought for this was when we look at an ideology like communism or socialism or even, laissez-faire capitalism, leave me alone, let me do what I want, libertarianism.
Right.
We really should ask, instead of like having an immediate emotional reaction to it, we should ask ourselves a few questions about this. And we should ask ourselves, okay, where do we see inequality in the world today? What are some possible ways to respond to it? What are the right ways to respond to it? Which idea is the best? And how can we avoid falling into the traps of, falling into the same mistakes our ancestors made? So that's just a few ideas I want to leave with you all, because it's really important to, tackle problems within society. But how you do it and how you determine what's the right way to do it, that's up to you. So
That's true.
it's a really complex topic.
All right, Brad.
What?
Solve society right now.
Solve society?
What do you think? What parts of communism do you think we should keep, and what parts do you think we should get rid of?
I think we should definitely have like a more even distribution of profits. It doesn't need to all be going to the top. That creates, the problem of the 1% dominating everything. I think we need, better safety nets so that people, don't have to, lose their livelihood or go bankrupt because their kid got cancer or some horrible crap like that. I really had to restrain myself from using another 4-letter word, so.
Yes, you'll get in trouble.
Yeah, I'm sure Matt would come after me. So what do you think?
I am too tired right now to figure out, but maybe one day we could dissect it and figure out if we can come up with the perfect society.
Yeah, and do a politics episode.
That would be so interesting.
Yeah, it would. So thanks all for joining us. We'll be back next week talking about something. We haven't decided that yet.
You haven't decided?
No, I haven't.
Oh, wow.
So.
Well, that's up in the air. Why don't you tweet? Can we tweet?
Yeah, we can.
What is your handle?
Oh yeah, you can tweet
History
You can
Dank?
tweet us at History Dank. That's with a capital H and a capital D, and tell us